The funeral of Countess Margaret Thornfield drew the highest levels of English society to the ancient chapel at Thornfield Manor, their black-clad figures a somber contrast to the October countryside that blazed with autumn colours outside the stone walls. Duke Maximilian Ashworth stood among the mourners with the rigid posture that had become his trademark, his amber eyes fixed on the ornate casket that held one of the few women whose opinion had ever mattered to him. Lady Isabella Thornfield knelt in the front pew, her golden hair covered by a black veil that could not conceal the profound grief that had transformed her from the vibrant young woman he remembered into someone aged by loss beyond her 26 years. She had maintained perfect composure throughout the lengthy service, but Duke Maximilian could see the trembling in her gloved hands that spoke to emotions held in check through sheer force of will. The year was 1851, and the rigid social structures that governed aristocratic behavior demanded certain responses to death, grief, and family obligation. But as Duke Maximilian watched Lady Isabella struggle with composure that was as much performance as genuine dignity, he found himself questioning whether duty and social expectation should always take precedence over human compassion. The Countess had been Isabella's mother, confidant and closest friend, the woman who had raised her daughter to understand both privilege and responsibility while shielding her from the darker aspects of noble society that could destroy innocent spirits. Her death from consumption had been neither sudden nor unexpected, but it had left Isabella truly alone in the world for the first time in her protected life. As the final prayers were spoken, and the congregation began to file out toward the burial grounds, Duke Maximilian found himself studying Isabella's profile with an intensity that would have been improper under different circumstances. 3 years had passed since their last meaningful conversation, 3 years during which duty and family pressure had kept them apart despite feelings that had never been properly acknowledged or resolved. The funeral procession moved with ceremonial solemnity toward the family cemetery, where generations of Thornfield ancestors lay beneath elaborate monuments to nobility, wealth, and social position. Isabella walked alone behind her mother's casket, her isolation among the crowd of mourners, a stark reminder that the Countess's death had left her without family protection in a world where unprotected women faced challenges that could destroy them. Duke Maximilian had arrived at Thornfield with specific intentions that had seemed clear and necessary when planned in the comfort of his London study. Isabella's mother was dead, her father had died 2 years earlier, and the estate would pass to a distant male cousin who had already expressed his intention to sell the property and invest the proceeds in more profitable ventures. Isabella would be left with a modest inheritance and the need to find either employment or a husband willing to accept a wife whose family fortune had been largely depleted by her father's gambling debts. The practical solution to her circumstances was obvious: marriage to someone with sufficient wealth and social standing to provide security while offering her the protection that her birth and breeding deserved. Duke Maximilian possessed both requirements in abundance, and their families had discussed the advantages of such an alliance for years before circumstances had made it an immediate necessity rather than a distant possibility. But as he watched Isabella place a single white rose on her mother's grave, with hands that shook despite her obvious efforts at control, Duke Maximilian found his carefully planned proposal dissolving under the weight of her visible grief and his own growing understanding that duty alone was an inadequate foundation for the kind of marriage that would honor both their characters. The reception following the burial was held in Thornfield Manor's Great Hall, transformed for the occasion, with black drapery and subdued lighting that emphasized the solemnity of the gathering. Isabella moved through the crowd of mourners with grace that impressed everyone present, accepting condolences with dignity while managing the complex social dynamics that death created among the nobility. Duke Maximilian approached her as she stood near the massive fireplace that dominated the hall's eastern wall, its flames providing warmth that seemed unable to penetrate the chill that surrounded her like an invisible barrier. "Lady Isabella," he said formally, offering the slight bow that protocol demanded, "please accept my deepest condolences on your mother's passing." The Countess was a remarkable woman whose influence extended far beyond her immediate family. "Your Grace?" Isabella replied with equal formality, though her blue eyes held recognition of the complex history that existed between them. "Thank you for attending today's service. Mother always spoke of you with great respect and affection." The reference to her mother's opinion created an opening that Duke Maximilian had been planning to use, but seeing Isabella's obvious exhaustion and grief made his prepared words seem suddenly inadequate to the moment's emotional reality. "Lady Isabella," he said carefully, "perhaps when you have had time to recover from today's ordeal, we might discuss your future circumstances. I understand that your situation has become complicated by recent events." The euphemistic reference to her financial difficulties and social vulnerability was diplomatically phrased but unmistakably clear in its implications. Isabella's circumstances were indeed complicated, and everyone present understood that her options were limited by factors beyond her control. "Your Grace is most considerate," Isabella replied with composure that masked whatever feelings his suggestion might have provoked. "Though I confess that thoughts of the future seem rather premature when the present remains so overwhelming." Before Duke Maximilian could respond, their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Lord Pemberton, Isabella's elderly guardian and executor of her parents' estate. His expression was grave as he approached them with obvious reluctance to disturb their discussion. "Your Grace, Lady Isabella," he said with the careful formality that suggested news of considerable importance, "forgive the interruption, but there are urgent matters requiring immediate attention that cannot wait for more appropriate timing." "What matters?" Isabella asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected that whatever Lord Pemberton needed to discuss would add new complications to circumstances that were already challenging enough. "Legal matters regarding the estate's settlement," Lord Pemberton replied diplomatically. "Perhaps we might speak privately about arrangements that will affect your immediate future." Duke Maximilian recognized the dismissal implicit in Lord Pemberton's request for privacy, but he also understood that whatever legal complications had arisen would likely reinforce the practical necessity of the marriage arrangement he had come to propose. "Of course," he said with appropriate courtesy. "Lady Isabella, perhaps we might continue our conversation at a more suitable time, when you have had opportunity to address these immediate concerns." As he moved away to allow Isabella and Lord Pemberton to speak privately, Duke Maximilian found himself observing the interaction from across the Great Hall with growing concern about whatever additional challenges were about to be revealed. Through the crowd of departing mourners, he could see Isabella's face growing progressively paler as Lord Pemberton explained whatever legal complications had arisen. Her responses were too quiet to be overheard, but her obvious distress suggested that her circumstances were even more precarious than he had understood. It was then that he noticed something that had escaped his attention during the formal ceremony, a subtle change in Isabella's appearance that spoke to more than grief and exhaustion. The way she held herself, the careful positioning of her hands, the particular pallor that marked her complexion, all of it suggested possibilities that would transform their discussion of her future from practical arrangement to urgent necessity. Duke Maximilian felt his understanding of the situation shifting as he began to suspect that Lady Isabella's need for protection and security might extend far beyond simple financial considerations. If his growing suspicions proved accurate, then the proposal he had come to make would be rejected, not because of social or emotional considerations, but because of secrets that could destroy both their reputations if revealed under the wrong circumstances. The question was whether Isabella herself understood the full implications of her situation, or whether she remained unaware of complications that would make any marriage proposal, no matter how practical or well-intentioned, impossible to accept from someone who was not prepared to protect more than just her personal welfare. As the reception began to wind down, and guests prepared to depart for their respective estates, Duke Maximilian realized that his carefully planned intervention in Isabella's circumstances was about to become far more complex than simple duty or social obligation could address. The woman he had come to rescue from financial difficulty was about to reveal that her true situation required protection of a kind that went far beyond anything he had prepared himself to provide. The private discussion between Lady Isabella and Lord Pemberton took place in the estate's library, surrounded by volumes that had witnessed generations of Thornfield family crises, but none quite as delicate as the revelation that would reshape both their immediate plans and long-term strategies for Isabella's protection. "My dear," Lord Pemberton said with the gentle firmness that had characterized his relationship with Isabella since her father's death, "the estate's financial review has revealed circumstances that require immediate attention and careful handling." Isabella settled into the chair that had been her mother's favorite, its familiar comfort providing small solace as she prepared to hear whatever additional complications Lord Pemberton had discovered. "What circumstances?" she asked, though her tone suggested she was already bracing for news that would make her situation even more challenging than she had feared. "Your father's debts were more extensive than initially calculated," Lord Pemberton explained with obvious reluctance. "The estate's sale will satisfy most obligations, but your inheritance will be considerably smaller than anticipated. Perhaps £200 annually, enough for modest independence but insufficient for maintaining your current social position." The news was disappointing but not unexpected. Isabella had understood since her father's death that his gambling had compromised the family's financial security, leaving her dependent upon her own resources and whatever marriage arrangements could be negotiated. "I see," she said quietly. "And the Duke's interest in my circumstances?" "Duke Maximilian's proposal would solve your immediate financial concerns," Lord Pemberton acknowledged. "His offer is generous, honourable, and would provide the security your parents always hoped you would achieve through marriage." "But," Isabella prompted, recognizing that Lord Pemberton's expression suggested complications beyond simple financial arrangements. "But there are aspects of your current situation that make any immediate marriage proposal problematic," Lord Pemberton said carefully. "Isabella, my dear, when did you last see Dr. Morrison for a consultation?" The question struck her with the force of revelation. Dr. Morrison had been the family physician for decades, the man who had attended her through childhood illnesses and recent grief-related ailments. His most recent visit, 6 weeks earlier, had been ostensibly routine, but Isabella now realized that Lord Pemberton's knowledge of it suggested concerns that went beyond ordinary medical care. "6 weeks ago," she replied slowly. "He said I was suffering from nervous exhaustion following mother's prolonged illness and father's earlier death." "And did Dr. Morrison express any concerns about your overall health?" Lord Pemberton asked, with the delicacy that suggested he already knew the answer. Isabella felt her world shifting as she began to understand the implications of Lord Pemberton's careful questions. The symptoms she had attributed to grief and stress, the fatigue, the occasional nausea, the changes in her physical condition, might have explanations that would indeed make Duke Maximilian's proposal impossible to accept. "Lord Pemberton," she said with growing alarm, "what has Dr. Morrison told you about my condition?" "He has told me," Lord Pemberton said gently, "that you are with child, approximately 3 months along by his calculation, which would place conception in early August." The revelation struck Isabella like a physical blow. Early August, when she had attended the house party at Lord Ashford's estate, when circumstance and champagne and the desperate loneliness that had followed her father's death had led to a single night of passion with someone whose identity she had promised herself to never acknowledge. "Does anyone else know?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Only Dr. Morrison and myself," Lord Pemberton assured her. "And we both understand the delicate nature of the situation and the necessity for complete discretion." Isabella rose from her chair and moved to the window that overlooked the estate's gardens, her mind racing through the implications of a pregnancy that would destroy any chance of the respectable marriage that represented her only hope of security. "The father?" Lord Pemberton asked gently. "Is not available for marriage?" Isabella replied with finality that discouraged further questions. "Lord Pemberton, what are my options under these circumstances?" "Limited," he admitted honestly. "Retirement to the continent until after the birth, followed by quiet adoption arrangements, might preserve your reputation sufficiently to allow marriage at some future date. Or, marriage to someone willing to accept your condition and acknowledge the child as his own," Lord Pemberton said carefully, "though finding such a husband would require either deception or extraordinary circumstances." The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the library door, followed by the butler's announcement that Duke Maximilian was requesting a private audience with Lady Isabella at her earliest convenience. "He's still here," Isabella observed with growing panic. "Lord Pemberton, he cannot know about my condition. If he learns the truth, he will learn the truth eventually if you consider his proposal seriously," Lord Pemberton pointed out gently. "Isabella, Duke Maximilian is an honourable man whose reputation suggests he might be more understanding than you fear." "Understanding enough to marry a woman carrying another man's child?" Isabella asked with bitter realism. "Lord Pemberton, no man of his station would accept such circumstances, regardless of his personal honour." "Perhaps not," Lord Pemberton agreed, But perhaps it would be wise to discover his actual response rather than assuming rejection based on conventional expectations. Before Isabella could respond, the library door opened to admit Duke Maximilian himself, his expression carrying the controlled intensity that had characterized his approach to every important decision in his adult life. "Your Grace," Lord Pemberton said with formal courtesy that barely concealed his concern about the timing of this interruption, "Lady Isabella and I were just concluding our discussion of estate matters." "Forgive my intrusion," Duke Maximilian replied, though his amber eyes were fixed on Isabella's pale face with obvious concern for her welfare. "But I wanted to speak with Lady Isabella before departing, and I understand that circumstances may require immediate decisions about her future." Isabella felt trapped between the necessity of maintaining social proprieties and the desperate need to avoid discussions that could only lead to humiliation and rejection. Her condition would become obvious within weeks, making any deception both temporary and ultimately destructive. "Your Grace," she said with carefully maintained composure, "I fear that circumstances have indeed changed in ways that make previous discussions of my future inappropriate." "What circumstances?" Duke Maximilian asked directly, his military background evident in his preference for clear communication over diplomatic evasion. Isabella exchanged glances with Lord Pemberton, seeing in his expression both support for honesty and understanding of her reluctance to reveal truths that could destroy any chance of maintaining dignity through this crisis. "Circumstances," she said finally, "that make marriage to anyone impossible for the foreseeable future." The cryptic response clearly frustrated Duke Maximilian, but it also seemed to confirm suspicions that had been growing since he had observed her careful movements and particular pallor during the funeral service. "Lady Isabella," he said with gentle firmness, "if you are in some kind of difficulty that affects your availability for marriage, perhaps I might be of assistance in addressing whatever complications have arisen." The offer of help was both generous and terrifying. Generous because it suggested genuine concern for her welfare, terrifying because it invited explanations that would inevitably lead to rejection and social destruction. "Your Grace," she replied with dignity that cost enormous effort to maintain, "some difficulties cannot be addressed through assistance, however well-intentioned. They can only be endured with whatever grace circumstances allow." "Isabella," Duke Maximilian said, dropping formal address in a way that suggested the depth of his concern, "are you with child?" The direct question eliminated any possibility of continued evasion. Isabella felt the blood drain from her face as she realized that her attempts at discretion had been inadequate against someone with Duke Maximilian's experience in reading both tactical situations and human behavior. "Yes," she said simply, the single word carrying the weight of social ruin and personal devastation. Duke Maximilian was silent for several long moments, his expression revealing nothing of his reaction to a revelation that would normally end any possibility of marriage between members of their social class. "And the father?" he asked finally. "Is not available," Isabella replied with the same finality she had shown to Lord Pemberton's identical question. "Cannot or will not marry you." "Cannot," Isabella said firmly, understanding that some truths were too dangerous to reveal even under these circumstances. Duke Maximilian studied her face with an intensity that suggested he was weighing factors far beyond simple social convention or personal disappointment. "Lady Isabella," he said finally, "I came here today to propose marriage because I believed it would serve both our interests while providing you with the protection your circumstances required. Learning about your pregnancy does not change my assessment of your character or my respect for your dignity in facing impossible circumstances." Isabella stared at him in amazement, unable to believe that he was suggesting continued interest in marriage, despite revelations that would send most men of his station fleeing without backward glances. "Your Grace," she said with growing hope and terror, "surely you cannot mean to suggest that my condition would be acceptable under any marriage arrangement." "I am suggesting," Duke Maximilian replied with conviction that surprised them all, "that your condition creates challenges that can be addressed through careful planning and absolute discretion, if you are willing to trust me with the protection you and your child will require." The offer was both miraculous and impossible. Miraculous because it represented salvation from social destruction, impossible because it demanded trust and sacrifice from someone who had no obligation to provide either. Looking into his amber eyes, Isabella realized that Duke Maximilian Ashworth was offering not just marriage, but genuine partnership in facing circumstances that would test every resource they possessed while building a future worthy of the courage required to create it. The proposal that followed Lord Pemberton's tactful withdrawal from the library was unlike any marriage negotiation that either Duke Maximilian or Lady Isabella had ever imagined participating in, conducted as it was under circumstances that challenged every social convention while demanding complete honesty about motivations that went far beyond romantic sentiment. "Lady Isabella," Duke Maximilian said, as they settled into chairs positioned near the fireplace that provided both warmth and privacy for their extraordinary conversation, "before we discuss specific arrangements, I need you to understand exactly what I am offering and why." "I'm listening," Isabella replied, though her voice carried the wariness of someone who had learned to expect disappointment from apparently generous offers. "What I am offering is marriage under terms that would protect both your reputation and your child's legitimacy, while providing you with security that goes far beyond financial considerations," Duke Maximilian explained, with the careful precision that characterized his approach to complex problems. "And what would you receive in return for such extraordinary generosity?" Isabella asked, recognizing that no marriage arrangement, however altruistic it might appear, could be entirely one-sided in its benefits. Duke Maximilian was quiet for several moments, his amber eyes reflecting considerations that went beyond immediate tactical advantages to questions of long-term strategy and personal fulfillment that he had rarely allowed himself to examine closely. "I would receive," he said finally, "partnership with a woman whose character and intelligence I have admired for years, despite circumstances that have prevented us from exploring what such partnership might become under more conventional conditions." The admission was more personal than Isabella had expected, suggesting that his proposal was motivated by considerations beyond duty or charitable impulse. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "are you suggesting that this marriage would be more than a business arrangement designed to solve my immediate difficulties?" "I am suggesting that it could become whatever we choose to make it," Duke Maximilian replied honestly. "The foundation would be practical necessity, but the future could be built on whatever understanding develops between us over time." Before Isabella could respond to this carefully crafted balance between hope and realism, their conversation was interrupted by urgent knocking at the library door, followed by Lord Pemberton's hasty entrance with news that would complicate their already complex situation. "Forgive the interruption," he said with obvious agitation, "but we have unexpected visitors whose presence creates immediate concerns about discretion and timing." "What visitors?" Duke Maximilian asked, his military instincts immediately alert to potential threats. "Lord Ashford and his son Marcus," Lord Pemberton replied grimly. "They claim to have come to pay respects to the Countess, but their timing and Marcus's particular interest in Lady Isabella's circumstances suggest other motivations." Isabella felt ice forming in her veins at the mention of Lord Ashford's name. The house party where her child had been conceived had taken place at his estate under his roof, with his knowledge of the social dynamics that had made such indiscretion possible. "Do they know about my condition?" she asked with growing panic. "Marcus has been making inquiries about your health and availability that suggest either suspicion or knowledge of your situation," Lord Pemberton replied with obvious concern. "His questions have been carefully phrased, but their direction is unmistakable." Duke Maximilian's expression hardened with understanding of the implications. If Marcus Ashford knew or suspected Isabella's pregnancy, his presence represented a threat that could destroy any chance of managing the situation through discreet marriage arrangements. "What does Marcus want?" he asked grimly. "Marriage to Lady Isabella," Lord Pemberton replied. "He has indicated willingness to accept her reduced financial circumstances in exchange for the social advantages that connection to the Thornfield family would provide." "And if he knows about the pregnancy?" Isabella asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Then he would expect significant financial compensation for accepting damaged goods," Lord Pemberton said with brutal honesty. "Or he might use the information to force terms that would be tantamount to blackmail." Duke Maximilian rose from his chair and moved to the window that provided a view of the main drive, where an elaborate carriage bearing the Ashford arms was indeed approaching with the unhurried confidence of invited guests. "How long do we have before they reach the house?" he asked. "Perhaps 10 minutes, Lord Pemberton estimated. Enough time to reach decisions about how to handle their visit, but not enough time for extended planning." Duke Maximilian turned back to Isabella with an expression that combined determination and something deeper, a protectiveness that went beyond mere duty to suggest genuine concern for her welfare. "Lady Isabella," he said with quiet intensity, "I need an answer to my proposal immediately. If you accept, I can protect you from whatever Marcus Ashford has planned. If you decline, you will face whatever consequences his knowledge might bring without any assistance I can provide." The choice was brutal in its simplicity. Trust a man she had known formally for years but intimately not at all, or face the predatory attention of someone whose interest in her condition was clearly opportunistic rather than protective. "What specific protection can you provide?" Isabella asked, recognizing that practical considerations must guide her decision regardless of her personal feelings. "Immediate marriage by special license, followed by a honeymoon journey that removes you from England until your condition becomes obvious," Duke Maximilian replied, with the efficiency of someone who had been planning for such contingencies. "When we return, the child will be acknowledged as legitimate and premature, a fiction that society will accept if we present it with sufficient conviction. And Marcus's knowledge or suspicions will become irrelevant once you are married to someone with superior social standing and legal authority," Duke Maximilian said, with grim satisfaction. "Marcus can harbor whatever suspicions he chooses, but he cannot act on them without proof, and married women enjoy certain protections under law that unmarried mothers do not." Through the library windows, Isabella could see the Ashford carriage drawing closer to the main entrance, its occupants representing a threat that would materialize within minutes, regardless of whatever decisions she made. "Your Grace," she said, with the desperate courage of someone whose options had been reduced to a single choice, "I accept your proposal, and I place myself under your protection with gratitude that I can never adequately express." "Then we must act immediately," Duke Maximilian said, moving to the library's writing desk where he began drafting documents with practiced efficiency. "Lord Pemberton, I need you to send for Dr. Morrison immediately. We require medical testimony regarding Lady Isabella's health that will support our narrative about the wedding's timing." "What narrative?" Isabella asked, as the reality of their situation began to crystallize around rapidly approaching deadlines. "That we have been secretly engaged for months, that our wedding was delayed only by your mother's illness, and that we chose to marry immediately after her funeral, rather than observing extended mourning that would postpone our happiness unnecessarily," Duke Maximilian explained while writing with rapid precision. "Will anyone believe such a story?" Isabella asked. "Society will believe whatever serves its interest in avoiding scandal," Duke Maximilian replied pragmatically. "Our version of events provides a romantic alternative to speculation about more sordid explanations." The sound of carriage wheels on gravel announced the arrival of their unwelcome visitors, just as Duke Maximilian completed the emergency documentation that would transform Lady Isabella from vulnerable target to protected wife within the next few hours. "Lord Pemberton," he said with military authority, "please inform Lord Ashford and Marcus that Lady Isabella is indisposed by grief and unable to receive visitors today. If they insist on remaining, they will be told that she is preparing for her wedding tomorrow morning." "Tomorrow morning?" Isabella asked with barely controlled panic. "By special license, which I carry with me as a matter of routine preparation," Duke Maximilian confirmed. "Heir Isabella, in 18 hours you will be the Duchess of Ashworth, with all the legal protections and social authority that title provides." As footsteps approached the library door, and voices in the hallway announced that Lord Ashford was indeed insisting on paying his respects to the bereaved Lady Isabella, both realized that their extraordinary marriage would begin under circumstances that tested every resource they possessed, while determining whether protection offered in desperation could evolve into partnership built on mutual respect and growing affection. The woman Duke Maximilian had come to rescue from financial difficulty was about to become his duchess under conditions that neither had anticipated but both understood were necessary for survival in a world where social predators viewed pregnancy without marriage as opportunity for exploitation rather than cause for compassion. The emergency wedding of Duke Maximilian and Lady Isabella took place at dawn the following morning in Thornfield Manor's private chapel, conducted with necessary haste but surprising dignity considering the circumstances that had prompted such immediate action. Bishop Whitmore, summoned from his nearby parish, performed the ceremony with the discretion that his 40 years of serving aristocratic families had taught him was often more valuable than elaborate ritual. Isabella wore her mother's wedding dress, altered overnight by the estate's seamstresses, to accommodate both her slight figure and the early signs of her condition that would soon make concealment impossible. The pale ivory silk and ancient lace seemed to bridge generations of Thornfield brides, lending legitimacy to a marriage that circumstances had stripped of conventional courtship and ceremony. Duke Maximilian appeared in full morning dress despite the early hour, his presence commanding enough to transform even this hasty ceremony into something approaching the dignity that such an important commitment deserved. When he spoke his vows, his voice carried conviction that surprised Isabella with its apparent sincerity. "Do you, Maximilian Edward Ashworth, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and health, for richer or poorer, until death do you part?" "I do," Duke Maximilian replied, his amber eyes fixed on Isabella's face, with an intensity that suggested these words meant more to him than mere social necessity. "Do you, Isabella Catherine Thornfield, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to love, honor, and cherish, through whatever challenges may come, until death do you part?" "I do," Isabella said, her voice carrying clearly, despite the emotional turmoil that had characterized every moment since her pregnancy had been revealed. The kiss that sealed their marriage was brief but electric, carrying promises that neither had yet had time to fully understand, but both hoped would prove worthy of the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them together. Lord Pemberton served as witness alongside Dr. Morrison, whose medical testimony would support whatever explanations became necessary regarding the timing and motivations for such a rapid wedding. Both men understood the delicate nature of the situation they were helping to manage, and both had expressed confidence in Duke Maximilian's character and capability to protect Isabella through whatever challenges lay ahead. Following the ceremony, the newly married couple departed immediately for the Duke's estate at Ravenswood, where they would spend the coming weeks establishing their household, while Isabella's condition progressed beyond the point where concealment would be possible. The journey through the Yorkshire countryside provided their first real opportunity for private conversation as husband and wife. "Your Grace," Isabella began, then stopped herself with a slight smile. "I suppose I must learn to think of you differently now that we are married." "Maximilian," he corrected gently, though his tone suggested understanding of how difficult such adjustment would be given the unusual circumstances of their union. "And I hope that in time you will think of me as more than simply the man who provided emergency protection for your reputation." "What would you like me to think of you as?" Isabella asked, recognizing that their relationship would need to evolve far beyond the practical arrangement that had motivated their wedding. "As your partner in building something worthwhile from circumstances that neither of us chose but both of us must live with," Maximilian replied thoughtfully. "Isabella, I want you to understand that this marriage need not be merely a business arrangement designed to solve immediate problems." "What else could it be?" she asked, though her tone suggested genuine curiosity rather than skepticism. "It could be the foundation for the kind of partnership that serves both our needs while providing your child with the security and legitimacy that every child deserves," Maximilian said with growing conviction. "But that will require honesty between us about expectations, boundaries, and the possibility that arranged marriage might evolve into something more meaningful." Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of Ravenswood Castle, rising from the Yorkshire moors like something from a fairy tale with its ancient towers and extensive grounds that spoke to centuries of wealth and social position. For Isabella, the site represented both sanctuary and challenge. Sanctuary from the immediate threats that had driven her to accept Maximilian's protection, challenge in the form of learning to be mistress of one of England's greatest estates. "It's magnificent," she said with genuine appreciation for the castle's imposing beauty. "It's home," Maximilian replied simply. "And now it's your home as well, for as long as you choose to remain." The careful phrasing suggested that he understood their marriage was, at least initially, more contract than romantic commitment, and that Isabella's long-term happiness would depend upon her finding genuine contentment in the life they built together, rather than simply accepting protection for protection's sake. Their arrival at Ravenswood was greeted by household staff who had been prepared for the Duke's sudden marriage, but clearly remained curious about the bride, whose background and circumstances had necessitated such unusual haste. Mrs. Morrison, the head housekeeper, received Isabella with professional courtesy that gradually warmed into genuine welcome as she observed the new Duchess's gracious manner and obvious intelligence. "Your Grace, Mrs." Morrison said, as she conducted Isabella through the castle's principal rooms, His Grace has instructed us to ensure that you have everything necessary for your comfort and convenience. Please do not hesitate to request whatever modifications or arrangements would make Ravenswood feel more like home. The tour of her new residence revealed quarters that had been prepared with obvious care. A suite of rooms that provided both privacy and luxury, while connecting to the Duke's apartments through doors that could remain closed or opened according to whatever understanding developed between them. These were the previous Duchess's rooms, Mrs. Morrison explained, as they examined the elegant sitting room that adjoined the master bedroom. His Grace's mother, who passed away 5 years ago. He has had them completely redecorated in anticipation of your arrival. The consideration implied by such preparation touched Isabella deeply, suggesting that Maximilian's offer of marriage had been motivated by more than mere impulse or charitable obligation. That evening, as they dined together in the castle's smaller dining room, Isabella found herself observing her new husband with growing appreciation for qualities that went beyond his obvious advantages of wealth, title, and social position. "Maximilian," she said as they concluded their meal, "I need to ask you something that may seem presumptuous given how recently we were married." "Ask whatever you need to know," he replied. "Honesty between us is essential if this arrangement is to serve either of our interests effectively." "Why did you truly offer to marry me?" Isabella asked directly. "Your explanations thus far have been perfectly reasonable, but I suspect there are motivations you haven't shared." Maximilian was quiet for several moments, his amber eyes reflecting considerations that went beyond the tactical advantages he had previously emphasized. "Because," he said finally, "I have admired you for longer than circumstances have allowed me to express, and because the thought of you facing social destruction while carrying a child was intolerable to me." "Admired me how?" Isabella pressed gently. "Your intelligence, your grace under pressure, your refusal to compromise your principles even when doing so might have eased your circumstances," Maximilian replied with growing warmth. "Isabella, what began as practical rescue has revealed itself to be opportunity for something I had not dared hope to find." "What opportunity?" "The opportunity to discover whether marriage based on mutual respect and shared challenges might evolve into something approaching genuine partnership," he said carefully. "I cannot promise you romantic love, but I can promise you respect, protection, and the chance to build a life together that honors both our characters." Before Isabella could respond, their conversation was interrupted by urgent knocking at the dining room door, followed by the butler's announcement that Lord Ashford and his son Marcus had arrived at Ravenswood, demanding immediate audience with the Duke on matters of urgent importance. "They followed us," Isabella said with growing alarm. "Maximilian, if they know about my condition and they're determined to make trouble, they will discover that making trouble for the Duchess of Ashworth is far more complicated than harassing an unprotected widow," Maximilian replied grimly, rising from his chair with the controlled authority that had made him one of England's most respected peers. As they prepared to face whatever challenges Marcus Ashford's persistence might bring to their fragile new marriage, both understood that their partnership would be tested immediately by enemies whose resources and determination remained unknown, but whose intentions were clearly hostile. The woman Maximilian had married to protect was about to discover whether ducal authority would prove sufficient defense against predators who viewed her pregnancy as weakness to be exploited rather than life to be cherished. The confrontation with Lord Ashford and his son Marcus took place in Ravenswood Castle's Great Hall, where generations of dukes had received both honoured guests and unwelcome visitors with the authority that came from centuries of unquestioned social dominance. Duke Maximilian positioned himself slightly in front of Isabella, his stance protective but not defensive as he prepared to face whatever accusations or demands had prompted this uninvited intrusion. Lord Ashford entered with the swagger of someone who believed he held information that would shift the balance of power dramatically in his favour, while Marcus followed with barely concealed anticipation of a confrontation he had apparently been planning since learning of the hasty marriage that had frustrated his own designs. "Your Grace," Lord Ashford said with false courtesy that barely concealed his anger at having his plans disrupted, "how delightful to find you so recently married, though we were surprised to learn of such joyous news so soon after dear Lady Isabella's bereavement." "Lord Ashford," Duke Maximilian replied with icy formality, Ravenswood is my private residence, and you have not been invited to comment upon my domestic arrangements or their timing. Ah, but surely friends may offer congratulations on such happy occasions, Marcus interjected, with the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. Though we do wonder at the extraordinary haste with which these nuptials were arranged. Isabella felt her heart racing as she recognized the direction their interrogation was taking, but she also drew strength from Maximilian's protective presence and the legal authority that marriage had given her. The timing of our marriage, she said with quiet dignity, was determined by our desire to begin our life together without unnecessary delay following my mother's passing. Ah, how romantic, Marcus said with obvious disbelief, though interesting that such romantic urgency should coincide with certain developments that might have influenced the necessity for immediate union. The veiled accusation hung in the air like a challenge that could not be ignored without appearing to confirm whatever suspicions he harbored. Duke Maximilian stepped forward with the calm authority of someone accustomed to facing down enemies more dangerous than opportunistic social climbers. "Mr. Ashford," he said with dangerous quiet, "are you suggesting that my marriage to Lady Isabella was motivated by anything other than mutual affection and respect?" "I am suggesting," Marcus replied with growing boldness, "that certain circumstances regarding the lady's condition might have created urgency that romance alone would not account for." Before Duke Maximilian could respond to this direct challenge, the Great Hall's doors opened to admit Dr. Morrison, whose arrival had clearly been arranged to coincide with whatever revelation Marcus believed would destroy their carefully constructed narrative. "Dr. Morrison," Lord Ashford announced with satisfaction, "perhaps you could clarify certain medical matters that bear upon the timing of this marriage?" The elderly physician looked between the assembled parties with obvious discomfort at being drawn into what was clearly a hostile interrogation rather than a medical consultation. "My lords," he said carefully, "I am not certain what clarification you require regarding Her Grace's health and welfare." "We require clarification," Marcus said with growing aggression, "regarding the condition that necessitated such hasty marriage arrangements. Surely professional ethics do not prevent confirmation of circumstances that are already evident to experienced observation." Dr. Morrison's expression hardened with the professional dignity that had characterized his decades of service to aristocratic families, whose secrets he had guarded with absolute discretion. "Mr. Ashford," he said with cold formality, "professional ethics prevent me from discussing any patient's medical condition without their explicit consent, regardless of what you may believe your experienced observation has revealed." "Then perhaps," Marcus said, turning to Isabella with predatory intensity, "Her Grace would consent to clarify whether her marriage was motivated by romantic sentiment or practical necessity." The direct challenge required response that would either confirm or deny the accusations that everyone present understood were being made. Isabella felt the weight of multiple gazes fixed upon her as she prepared to provide answers that would determine not just her own reputation, but the future of her marriage to a man who had offered protection without demanding truth in return. "Mr. Ashford," she said with composure that impressed even herself, "my marriage to His Grace was motivated by sentiments and considerations that are neither your business nor subject to your speculation." "How diplomatically phrased," Marcus replied with obvious frustration at her refusal to provide the admission he sought. "But surely you cannot expect society to accept such obvious fiction when the evidence of deception will become apparent within months." "What evidence?" Duke Maximilian asked with lethal calm that suggested Marcus was approaching the limits of what would be tolerated even in the name of social investigation. "The evidence," Marcus said with triumphant malice, "that will become obvious when Her Grace delivers a child whose timing proves the marriage was arranged to legitimize pregnancy rather than celebrate romantic attachment." The accusation was now explicit and impossible to deflect through diplomatic evasion. Isabella felt her composure wavering as she realized that Marcus's knowledge was more complete than she had feared. But before she could respond, Maximilian's voice cut through the tension with absolute authority. "Mr. Ashford," he said with dangerous quiet, "you have just accused my wife of adultery and myself of complicity and fraud. Those accusations constitute slander of the most serious kind, and they will be answered accordingly." "Truth cannot be slander," Marcus protested, though his confidence seemed shaken by the Duke's obvious willingness to escalate the confrontation beyond mere social maneuvering. "Truth," Duke Maximilian replied with grim satisfaction, "is what I am about to provide." He moved to a side table where documents had been laid out with obvious preparation for exactly this moment, withdrawing papers that bore official seals and signatures. "These are," he announced, "are the records of my marriage to Lady Isabella, conducted 6 months ago by special license in the private chapel at Thornfield Manor, witnessed by her parents and blessed by Bishop Whitmore." The revelation struck the great hall like lightning. If Duke Maximilian and Isabella had been secretly married 6 months ago, then any pregnancy would be entirely legitimate, and their public ceremony merely a renewal of vows undertaken for social purposes. "Secret marriage," Marcus said weakly, though his objection carried little conviction in the face of official documentation. "Private marriage," Duke Maximilian corrected firmly, "conducted with full legal authority and proper religious blessing. Our public ceremony yesterday was undertaken to announce our union to society, not to create it." Lord Ashford studied the documents with growing dismay as he realized that his son's accusations had not merely failed, but had exposed them both to charges of slander against a duke whose resources and determination would make retaliation both swift and comprehensive. "These documents," he said desperately, "could have been forged." "By Bishop Whitmore?" Duke Maximilian asked, with raised eyebrow that suggested the absurdity of such accusations. "Lord Ashford, are you prepared to accuse a bishop of the Church of England of participating in document fraud?" The threat was clear and devastating. Accusations against Bishop Whitmore would involve church authorities whose investigation would reveal not just the truth about the documents, but the motivations behind the accusations themselves. "Perhaps," Lord Ashford said with obvious reluctance, "we have been misinformed about certain circumstances." "Perhaps," Duke Maximilian agreed with cold satisfaction, "you have allowed speculation to override good judgment regarding matters that were never your concern." As father and son prepared to depart in defeat, Marcus made one final attempt to salvage something from his failed expedition. "Your Grace," he said to Isabella with false courtesy, "please accept my apologies for any misunderstanding about the circumstances of your marriage. I hope you will find happiness in your new position." "I'm certain I shall," Isabella replied with quiet confidence that surprised even herself. "Thank you for your concern regarding my welfare." After their unwelcome visitors departed, Duke Maximilian turned to Isabella with an expression that combined relief at their victory with something deeper, pride in her composure under attack, and growing appreciation for the courage she had shown in defending their marriage against assault. "You were magnificent," he said simply. "Your dignity under interrogation was exactly what the situation required, as was your preparation," Isabella replied with growing admiration for the strategic thinking that had anticipated and countered Marcus's accusations so completely. "The marriage documents, were they genuine?" "Every word," Maximilian confirmed. "I obtained the special license and prepared the documentation immediately after our wedding yesterday, with Bishop Whitmore's cooperation in backdating certain records to provide protection against exactly the kind of attack we just survived." The revelation that their defense had been built on careful preparation rather than mere luck impressed Isabella with evidence of the thoroughness with which Maximilian had considered her protection. "Then we are truly safe from such accusations?" she asked. "Completely," Maximilian assured her. "Your child will be born legitimately, your reputation is secure, and anyone who chooses to question either will face the full resources of the Ashworth family in response." As they stood together in the great hall that had witnessed their triumph over enemies who had sought to destroy them both, Isabella realized that her marriage of necessity was beginning to evolve into something approaching genuine partnership built on mutual protection, respect, and the growing understanding that some bonds became stronger when tested by adversity. The months following the defeat of Marcus Ashford's accusations brought unexpected tranquility to Ravenswood Castle, as Duke Maximilian and Isabella settled into married life with growing comfort and mutual respect that surprised them both with its natural development. The early weeks of their union, which had begun as emergency protection for Isabella's reputation, gradually evolved into something approaching genuine partnership as they discovered shared interests and complementary strengths. Isabella's pregnancy progressed without complications under Dr. Morrison's careful supervision, her health remaining robust despite the emotional upheavals that had preceded her marriage. The castle staff, initially uncertain about their new mistress's background and circumstances, quickly grew to appreciate her gracious manner and intelligent approach to household management. "Your Grace, Mrs." Morrison reported one morning as Isabella reviewed the estate's domestic arrangements. The tenants have asked me to express their pleasure at having a duchess in residence again. They particularly appreciate your attention to the children's education and the improvements you've suggested for the workers' cottages. Isabella had indeed thrown herself into the responsibilities of her new position, finding purpose and satisfaction in work that went far beyond mere social obligation. Her involvement in estate management provided both distraction from lingering anxieties about her unconventional marriage and growing confidence in her ability to contribute meaningfully to their shared life. "Mrs. Morrison," she replied with the warmth that had characterized her relationship with the household staff, "please tell the tenants that their welfare and that of their children will always be among my highest priorities. A great estate's true measure lies in the prosperity of all who depend upon it." Duke Maximilian, observing these interactions, found himself impressed by Isabella's natural aptitude for the complexities of noble responsibility. Her intelligence and compassion, qualities he had recognized during their limited previous acquaintance, were proving perfectly suited to the demands of managing one of England's most significant estates. "You've taken to your new role remarkably well," he observed one evening as they dined together in the castle's family dining room, an intimacy that had replaced the formal Great Hall meals of their early weeks together. "Have I?" Isabella asked with genuine curiosity about his assessment. "I sometimes worry that my inexperience shows in ways that might embarrass your family's reputation." "On the contrary," Maximilian replied with conviction that surprised them both, "your fresh perspective has improved operations that had become routine rather than effective. The tenant families speak of you with affection that took my mother years to earn." The comparison to his mother was significant, as Isabella had learned from household stories and family portraits that the previous duchess had been beloved throughout the region for her charitable work and personal attention to those who depended upon the estate's prosperity. "Tell me about her," Isabella said gently, recognizing that Maximilian's relationship with his mother had shaped his understanding of what marriage and partnership could become. "She was remarkable," Maximilian said with obvious affection for memories that time had not dimmed. "Intelligent, compassionate, absolutely devoted to my father, despite their marriage having been arranged for political advantage rather than romantic attachment." "An arranged marriage that became something more?" Isabella asked with growing interest in parallels to their own circumstances. "Much more," Maximilian confirmed. "They often told me that their deepest happiness came not from the romantic passion that poets celebrate, but from the partnership they built through shared challenges and mutual respect that grew into profound love." The story provided hope for their own future, while acknowledging the reality that genuine affection could not be forced or fabricated, only nurtured through patience and mutual consideration. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a courier, bearing news that would test the strength of their developing partnership. A letter from the Queen herself, requesting Duke Maximilian's presence at court for consultations regarding foreign policy, matters that required his particular expertise. "How long would such consultations require?" Isabella asked as they reviewed the royal summons together. "Perhaps 6 weeks," Maximilian replied with obvious reluctance at the prospect of extended separation. "The timing is unfortunate, given your condition and the approaching birth." Isabella was indeed approaching the final months of her pregnancy. Her child expected to arrive in early spring according to Dr. Morrison's calculations. The prospect of facing childbirth without Maximilian's support was daunting, but she also understood that royal requests could not be declined without compelling justification. "You must go," she said, with the courage that had characterized her response to every challenge they had faced together. "Your obligations to the crown take precedence over domestic considerations, and I will manage perfectly well with Dr. Morrison's care and Mrs. Morrison's assistance." "Isabella," Maximilian said with growing concern, "I cannot leave you to face childbirth alone regardless of royal expectations." "You would not be leaving me alone," she replied firmly. "You would be leaving me surrounded by people who care about my welfare and supported by the knowledge that our marriage has given me security that extends far beyond your physical presence." The maturity of her response impressed Maximilian, even as it reinforced his reluctance to depart during such a crucial period. But as they discussed the practical implications of his absence, both began to understand that this separation would test whether their partnership had developed genuine foundations or remained dependent upon constant physical proximity. "Very well," Maximilian said finally, "but with conditions that ensure your safety and comfort during my absence." "What conditions?" Isabella asked. "Dr. Morrison will take up residence at the castle during my final month away. Additional staff will be engaged to ensure constant attendance, and you will promise to send word immediately if any complications arise that require my return." The arrangements were both practical and touching, evidence of genuine concern that went beyond mere duty to the woman who carried his heir. But as they discussed the details of his departure, neither anticipated the way their time apart would clarify feelings that proximity and shared challenges had been developing gradually. Maximilian's departure for court took place on a grey February morning that seemed to emphasize the solemnity of their separation. As his traveling coach disappeared beyond the castle gates, Isabella found herself experiencing emotions that surprised her with their intensity, not merely concern for her own welfare during his absence, but genuine sadness at losing his daily companionship. The weeks that followed revealed how thoroughly their lives had become intertwined during their months of marriage. Isabella found herself missing not just Maximilian's protection and support, but his conversation, his perspective on estate matters, and his quiet presence during evening meals that had become the foundation of their developing intimacy. His letters arrived regularly, filled with court gossip, political analysis, and increasingly personal observations about his own experience of their separation. "My dear Isabella," he wrote in one particularly revealing correspondence, "I find myself counting days until my return, not merely from duty to ensure your welfare during childbirth, but from genuine desire to resume the partnership that has become the most satisfying aspect of my life." Isabella's response carried equal honesty about her own changing feelings. "My dear Maximilian, what began as gratitude for your protection has evolved into appreciation for your character that goes far beyond simple thankfulness. I miss your presence in ways that suggest our marriage has become more meaningful to me than either of us initially anticipated." The exchange of such sentiments through correspondence allowed both to acknowledge feelings that might have remained unspoken in daily conversation, creating emotional intimacy that complemented the practical partnership they had been building. Maximilian's return to Ravenswood, 2 weeks before Isabella's expected delivery, was greeted with joy that neither attempted to conceal. Their reunion demonstrated conclusively that their marriage had evolved far beyond its emergency origins into genuine affection and mutual dependence. "Welcome home," Isabella said, as she embraced him in the castle's main hall, her advanced pregnancy making the gesture both tender and somewhat awkward. "Home," Maximilian repeated with satisfaction, looking around the great hall that had indeed become home in ways that went beyond mere ownership. "Isabella, has everything been well during my absence?" "Everything has been perfectly well," she assured him, "though I confess that your return makes it better than well." The birth of their son, 3 weeks later, provided the final transformation of their practical arrangement into indisputable family. James Maximilian Ashworth entered the world with the lusty cries that announced both his own health and his parents' success in creating security that had seemed impossible during the desperate circumstances that had brought them together. "He's perfect," Isabella whispered, as she held their child for the first time, marveling at the tiny features that already suggested both his parents' characteristics. "He's ours," Maximilian replied with wonder at the reality of fatherhood that had transformed him from protector to parent. "Isabella, thank you for trusting me with the protection that has given us both this extraordinary gift." As they sat together in the nursery that had been prepared with such hope and uncertainty, both understood that their marriage had achieved something far more precious than social respectability or financial security. They had created a family built on mutual respect, growing affection, and shared commitment to values that would guide their son's upbringing and their own continued partnership. The woman Duke Maximilian had married to protect had become the partner who made his own life complete, while the man who had offered emergency protection had proven himself worthy of love that neither had dared hope to find in arranged marriage. Their son would grow up hearing the story of how his parents met, how circumstances had brought them together, and how courage and kindness had transformed necessity into joy. But more importantly, he would grow up experiencing the daily reality of parents whose love had grown strong enough to weather any challenge and create happiness from the most unlikely beginnings. 10 years after that desperate wedding at dawn in Thornfield Manor's chapel, Duchess Isabella stood in the nursery of Ravenswood Castle, watching her youngest daughter Emma toddle around the room, while her eldest son James helped his brother Thomas with Latin translations at the small study table by the window. The scene of domestic tranquility bore little resemblance to the crisis that had brought her to this moment of perfect contentment. The intervening decade had transformed their marriage of necessity into something approaching legend among the local families who had witnessed Isabella's arrival as a desperate young widow and her evolution into one of Yorkshire's most beloved duchesses. Her work with estate improvements and charitable foundations had extended far beyond Ravenswood's boundaries, while her partnership with Maximilian had become the kind of union that served as an example to their children and inspiration to their community. "Mama," James called from his position at the study table, "Papa says he has important news to share when he returns from London. Do you know what it might be?" "I have some ideas," Isabella replied with maternal amusement at her son's curiosity. At 10, James possessed his father's analytical mind combined with his mother's compassionate nature, while 8-year-old Thomas showed early signs of the artistic temperament that had occasionally appeared in both family lines. Duke Maximilian's latest journey to court had been prompted by royal consultations regarding his potential appointment to significant government position, recognition of capabilities that had been demonstrated through years of successful estate management and diplomatic service. Isabella suspected that his news would involve decisions that would affect their entire family's future. Mrs. Morrison appeared in the nursery doorway with the afternoon correspondence and a smile that suggested pleasant developments. "Your Grace," she announced, "His Grace has returned from London and requests your presence in the library. He says he has wonderful news to share." Isabella found Maximilian in their private library, surrounded by official documents and wearing the expression of deep satisfaction that usually indicated successful completion of important business. At 45, he had grown even more distinguished with age, his dark hair now thoroughly silver, but his amber eyes as compelling as they had been during their first desperate conversation at her mother's funeral. "My dear," he said, embracing her with the warmth that had characterized their relationship since the early uncertainties had been resolved through time and mutual devotion. "I bring news that will change our circumstances considerably." "What news?" Isabella asked, though her tone suggested confidence that whatever changes he was announcing would be positive rather than challenging. "The Queen has offered me the position of ambassador to France," Maximilian replied with obvious pride in the recognition his service had received. "It would mean residence in Paris for at least 3 years, with full diplomatic immunity and authority to represent British interests in one of Europe's most important courts." The opportunity was extraordinary, reflecting royal confidence in Maximilian's abilities, while providing their family with experiences that would be both educational and socially advantageous. But it would also mean dramatic changes to the life they had built at Ravenswood. "And your response?" Isabella asked, recognizing that such decisions required careful consideration of factors beyond personal ambition. "Depends entirely upon your feelings about taking our children to live in Paris," Maximilian replied, with the consideration for her opinion that had characterized every major decision of their marriage. "The position would be prestigious and diplomatically significant, but it would also require leaving Ravenswood for an extended period." Isabella considered the implications carefully, weighing the advantages of international experience for their children against the disruption such changes would create in their well-established routines. The children would benefit enormously from exposure to French culture and diplomatic society, she said thoughtfully, "and you would thrive in work that utilizes your full capabilities rather than limiting you to estate management." "But," Maximilian prompted, recognizing that her consideration was revealing concerns as well as advantages, "but I worry about leaving the estate and tenant families for such an extended period," Isabella admitted. "So much of what we've accomplished here depends upon personal attention and direct involvement." Before Maximilian could respond, their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of their children, who had apparently grown tired of waiting for their parents' private discussion to conclude. "Papa!" Emma called out, as she toddled into the library with the fearless confidence that had become her trademark. "Did you bring presents from London?" "I brought something better than presents," Maximilian replied, scooping up his youngest daughter while gesturing for James and Thomas to join them near the fireplace. "I brought news about a great adventure our family might undertake together." "What kind of adventure?" James asked with the serious attention he devoted to all adult matters that might affect family circumstances. "Their journey to Paris, where I would serve as England's representative to the French court, while you and Thomas and Emma learned to speak French fluently and observed one of Europe's most sophisticated societies, Maximilian explained with enthusiasm that clearly communicated his own excitement about the opportunity. For how long? Thomas asked with the practical concern that characterized his approach to change. Perhaps 3 years, Isabella replied, watching their children's faces as they processed the implications of such extensive travel. Would we come back to Ravenswood? Emma asked with 3-year-old directness. Always, Maximilian assured her with absolute conviction. Ravenswood is our home, and it will remain our home regardless of how far our travels might take us. As the family discussed the practical details of the potential Paris assignment, Isabella found herself marveling at the security that allowed them to consider such dramatic changes with excitement rather than anxiety. The desperate circumstances that had driven her to accept Maximilian's protection had evolved into a partnership strong enough to embrace adventure rather than merely surviving crisis. There's something else, Maximilian added as their discussion wound down. The Queen specifically requested that you accompany me as full partner in diplomatic functions rather than merely as wife in residence. Your reputation for intelligence and charitable work has reached court, and Her Majesty believes your presence would enhance British influence in Parisian society. The recognition was both flattering and significant, suggesting that Isabella's evolution from desperate young widow to accomplished duchess had achieved notice at the highest levels of government. Then I believe, Isabella said with growing conviction, that we should accept this opportunity to serve our country while providing our children with experiences that will shape their understanding of the world beyond Yorkshire. Are you certain? Maximilian asked, though his expression suggested hope that her support would make acceptance possible. I'm certain that 10 years ago, I could never have imagined facing such decisions from a position of security and partnership, Isabella replied, with deep gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this moment. Maximilian, what began as protection for my reputation has become the foundation for a life that exceeds anything I dared hope for. Their kiss was witnessed by their children, who had learned to appreciate the love that provided security for their entire family. As they began planning for their French adventure, all 5 family members understood that their story had evolved from desperate rescue to extraordinary partnership to shared excitement about whatever challenges and opportunities lay ahead. The woman Maximilian had married to protect had become his equal partner in serving causes greater than themselves, while the man who had offered emergency salvation had discovered that true happiness came from building something beautiful with someone worthy of complete trust and devotion. Their children would grow up bilingual, diplomatically sophisticated and culturally aware, but more importantly, they would grow up secure in the knowledge that their parents' love had proven strong enough to transform crisis into opportunity and necessity into joy. The French court would welcome the British ambassador and his remarkable duchess, but they would never fully understand that the couple's effectiveness came not from training or ambition, but from partnership forged in adversity and strengthened through years of mutual respect that had grown into love capable of embracing whatever adventures the future might offer. Sometimes, they had learned, the most extraordinary love stories began with someone being brave enough to offer protection when protection was desperately needed, and wise enough to recognize that gratitude could grow into something far more precious when nurtured with patience, honesty, and shared commitment to values worth defending together. Before you go, tap the like button and subscribe for new stories every week.